Okay, so we are in lesson 3, early church fathers and the textual tradition. So basically, so we're following the outline. So we're in lesson 3, and this is the last of the first period. So we've got the 3 different time periods that we're going to look at. The first one was the 1st to 4th century. So basically, we haven't looked at anything about King James here. We haven't looked at anything about the Textus Receptus or anything like, because those things didn't exist at this stage. We looked at looking at the originals, and today we're looking at more about what the generation after the apostles, or a few generations after the apostles, how these people were now using the scriptures and what was happening, and anyway, we'll look at that. So then obviously next fortnight we'll get into the Reformation era, which is then where we get all the English Bibles coming and the different things like that. So that's we'll get into that. That's probably the more King James part of this study. So a study of the early church fathers I think is essential for understanding the development, the transmission, the preservation of the New Testament. So how it developed, how it was transmitted through the ages, and then basically preserved. The early church fathers, basically, they were just Christian leaders, theologians, scholars. These Christian, these early church fathers are basically just leaders of churches or theologians, people thinking about, spiritual matters, the Bible, things like that. And so that term is basically limited to those who lived from the 1st to the 5th century AD. And so they often were the ones who were defending Christian doctrines, and what makes them so valuable is that they quoted a lot of scriptures in their writings, which is what we're going to look at today. So various citations which serve as valuable secondary witnesses to the textual tradition. So for the primary witness would be the original, the apostles and the 1st century Christians, and then obviously the original manuscripts as well. That would be those primary witnesses, but now we're looking at the secondary witnesses. So unlike many of the people looking at the modern textual critics, people who study manuscripts and things like that, they obviously have thousands of manuscripts accessible to them. These people didn't. They just had handwritten copies, and they could only rely on what they understood as the most authoritative versions of that time. And so that gives us some insight. So the quotations that they have, it gives us some insights in which manuscript families were in circulation during the different regions. So what were they using in Egypt? What were they using in Western Europe or Asia Minor? It also tells us how textual variations, so differences in different manuscripts, were received and interpreted in the early church. So we're going to find that some of the early church fathers dealt with these issues. So they had commentaries, they had different writings that they had in which they actually dealt with some of the differences, which gives us which I'll go into. It makes some good conclusions about the Byzantine text as well that we'll look at later. Also provides insights in the stability and reliability of different text types. So again, if you remember the Byzantine texts, the Alexandrian texts, things like that, obviously by this time, by the 4th century onwards, there's basically an established different textual types now. So seems to be some differences with the Alexandrian texts and the Byzantine, and there's also Western text as well, which is more Latin texts. We also have, one significant thing is that no church father had access, like I mentioned, to the entirety of the manuscript traditions available today. So they didn't have all the Textus Receptus or all of the manuscripts available to us. So that's I think that's quite obvious. Which basically helps us to identify the different variants and the access that they had and what they found significant. Also, what they considered authoritative, and basically it helps to analyze more particular for our purposes the Byzantine text and how that actually had an early attestation or was developed. Whether it was an early text or was it developed later, as some people say. So some people say, no, the Byzantine text is developed much later. It's a medieval, so basically past the 5th, 6th century. It's a medieval text. It's not original, and so we can't trust it, even though it's the dominant tradition. So there's actually some things that actually counter that argument, but that's the predominant argument amongst a lot of people, biblical scholars today. Particularly the ones who favour the Alexandrian texts. That's their argument against the Byzantine. Okay, so basically this lesson, we're just going to look at what the main textual traditions, what were used and how they were compared. So obviously we already looked at this, so we sort of know the three main ones: the Byzantine, Alexandrian, Western. Which church fathers favoured the Byzantine readings, and how early can these readings be traced, which is quite important if we're going to argue that the line of manuscripts that we use or that we have, which is the underlying the King James, if it's not found early, then it's sort of questions whether these are the original. It doesn't necessarily have to be that case, but you would expect at least something to be found early. Which is what we find. And then how do patristic quotations? So patristic here just means church fathers. So when you see that word, it's the early church fathers. Comes from the Latin patra, which is father. So patristic. And how do the patristic quotations support or challenge modern textual critical assumptions as well? And so we're going to look at some of that. And so obviously I'm going to argue in favour of the Byzantine text, but also want to present a more balanced view as well. We can have various conspiracies and things like that, but it's not really helpful at this stage looking at some of these topics. Just want to look at, what do these manuscripts tell us? What does history tell us? And I think, so I guess it's more of a scientific approach. We're looking at some of the evidence that provides for us, and again, hoping or that it would reinforce our beliefs, for what we believe about the Word of God. Okay, so let's a little bit about the early church fathers. Who were they? So like I mentioned already, they were Christian leaders, like some pastors, teachers, scholars, and typically people separate them into two categories: the Greek fathers and the Latin fathers. So the Eastern Christians, and then the Western Latin-speaking Christians. So they're usually separated in that light. Why does their witness matter? So obviously they are human, they're men, they're not infallible, they're not inspired writers. So why does it matter what they say? Well, partly has to do with them being closer to the time of when the scriptures were actually written. That's a factor. And again, because of the Bible at this stage was still not even Well, everything was written. We had all the texts were obviously written by then, but you still had the Bible being compiled as a book at this stage. So it's still very early. So it's interesting to see how they dealt with this and some of the things that come from how they quoted. So they quoted scripture extensively in their homilies, especially the preaching or devotions and things like that. Their commentaries, various theological debates, and there were a lot of debates, especially in the early time, with various doctrines. And so in these works that they produced, they obviously quoted scripture extensively. Also, the manuscripts quotations predate the later textual standardizations. So basically, just what I said before, there wasn't at this stage there was not even the Alexandrian or Byzantine text. These were still manuscripts floating around, being circulated, being copied from various regions. It wasn't yet standardized at this point, anyway. So that's why we find in some of the works of the fathers that they have one variant and another, and then how do they sort of interact with that as well? And so basically, comparing their citations or their quotations with the known manuscripts basically helps us trace the development of the New Testament text. So we're basically just going back in time and looking at how all this was formed, and how, basically what they did brings it. It's part of the story of how we got it today. Yeah, it's part of it's a step. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It wasn't. Most of them weren't in a comfortable position in doing this thing. So, Okay, so let's look at the Greek fathers first. Meet the fathers. So, the first one is Origen or Origen. There's different ways people pronounce it, but it would most likely be Origen. He lived from 185 to 253 AD, so quite early. He was a textual scholar and exegete, so basically, a Bible teacher, an expert. Exegete just means someone who interprets scripture. Ex means to be interpreted, so he wrote commentaries and things like that. He compiled the Hexapla. So Hexapla was basically a 6-column document in which he had different translations of the Bible. So I think from memory, I should have went back and looked, but I think he had the Greek Old Testament, some other languages of the New Testament compiled together. And so from that, you could notice the differences. So he was one of the first guys to do that. Comparison of Old Testament texts, basically. But then that practice was then used later into the New Testament. So his New Testament citations reflect a more Alexandrian type text. So he was more leaning on the Alexandrian type text. Basically, it's kind of obvious because it's Origen of Alexandria. But he did have some Byzantine readings as well in some of his quotations. Some of his noted textual variances, commentaries, and they show. So it'll be a different story, I guess, if it just had Alexandrian text type. But he also uses some Byzantine readings, and those terms are probably they're more modern terms now we're using because they wouldn't understand. We said, "Oh, you're reading from the Alexandrian," they wouldn't understand that. That's what we're calling it. Obviously, but then he did show. This shows in his commentaries. It shows that there's obviously an awareness of a diversity of text at this time. So they were aware of this. And the next one we have is John Chrysostom, which is a little bit later, so from 349 to 407 AD. and so he was the Archbishop of Constantinople, prolific homilist. So he was to be a great preacher. I think I mentioned this last time. So his last name here, Chrysostomos, which means basically golden mouth. So he was known to be a great speaker, a great preacher. And you can read some of his stuff. They still have it today. So he dealt with a lot of actually issues of leadership abuse in the church and things like that, even at that time. So it's quite interesting. Some of his stuff is quite good. So he frequently quoted a New Testament, obviously being a leader of the church. He focused a lot of his preaching, or homilies as they call it, focused on the Gospels and Paul's epistles. And his citations show very early Byzantine type texts in his quotations, which again challenges the notion that the Byzantine text is a later development because it's been used at this time. So if he's using it at this time, obviously it came from an earlier source. And being even in the town he was, Constantinople, which was quite almost a capital at one point. So that's interesting there. But he has a lot of good stuff. The next one we have is Clement of Alexandria, so another one from Alexandria. So he's also early again to 150 to 215 AD. He's a teacher at a catechetical school, which is basically, I think a catechesis or is where, I think Catholics still use that term today, where you're basically a new Christian and you get taught the basic doctrines, so basically ABCs. That's our catechism, or how we catechize new members. And some of these terms are used today, but because it's been adopted heavily by like the Catholics and things like that, we sort of see these terms and we cringe a bit. But I guess we got to just look at it from the context of that time, not the Catholics as we know it didn't really happen until a bit much later, so obviously they're going to say no with the original church, etc. But there's not really much to do with that. But we got like some of these terms, today they've been very, used in Catholic sort of circles, but basically just a school where they will teach basic doctrine. Okay, so what do we have? His quotations of the Gospels actually show a mixed text. So he leans, so depending on what is on so for Matthew and Mark, he actually uses a Byzantine text. But in Gospel of John, he's using an Alexandrian text. So there's a mixture there in what he had. So he had some of this, that, he was... So it's quite interesting.
But that, of course, problems for
well, like we said, these names didn't exist then. These types, so it would be interesting to note if he had other versions of the Matthew Gospel, Mark's Gospel, like an Alexandrian type maybe, and then why did he use the Byzantine, or also for John, why did he use the Alexandrian if he had, So it could just simply be that was just what was available to him, that could be, maybe there wasn't more thought than that, okay, this is what I had, this is what I'm going to use. So, and this is kind of, I guess it goes back to that balanced approach where we find people like this using both types of manuscripts, and maybe this is, at this stage, I guess, maybe there wasn't some nefarious agenda, it was just what was available to him. Maybe that came later, I don't know. But it's interesting to see that. And so he often paraphrased scripture as well, rather than quoting it verbatim. So we do find a lot of paraphrases from Clement concerning scriptures as well. Well, it would depend, because the way you would paraphrase, I guess, what you're paraphrasing would depend on the text, I guess. But yeah, how you paraphrase, I think there'll still be an indication in the paraphrase of which scriptures he's using. Yeah. Yeah. But we do the same, when we're speaking about something, a topic, and we just say, we don't really say the verse, word for word. We just sort of say the topic, the gist of it, yeah. And that's basically what, like, remember, these are just people. Just because they're very old doesn't mean they're all like special, yeah. These are just humans,
Pretty cool looking backwards, exactly
Yeah. And because we find, these are ancient, texts, we ascribe some sort of, probably a more of a value. But no, we should test these people just as much as we test someone else, And sure, a lot of these people didn't have the same doctrines that we hold today. They differed from each other. Again, just like people today. What's that? Who's that? Maybe some of them. I don't know. Like, it's hard to. No, yeah, that's right. It wasn't used. It was just Christians. Like, it wasn't. Yeah. Much later, yeah, because then you start having these groups, like, obviously you had the Roman Catholics, you had, all those other groups that were sort of hidden, over time, known by different names. Because Christians weren't even called Christians at the start; they were just called people of the way. Like, yeah. So there was just Christian, and then over time, because the distinctions started to come out even more. Which only could happen over time, because the first few centuries were just times of persecution. So people didn't have time to just sit out and discuss these matters all the time. So, for example, that's what we find later in 4th, 5th century, these debates about, was Jesus fully man? Was he fully God? Was he, the Trinity, is God above the Father? How does that work? So all these different topics that people were talking about. And then, obviously, from debates arise different groups. Like, no, this is what we think, And so, then they're going to be called by different names, and that's just how it happens. Yeah.
Question: If they didn't face that, do you reckon if they didn't face that persecution of the groups and stuff, they would fall sooner, and then maybe
So, if there wasn't any persecution. Well, I think so, because we find even in, like, for example, in Acts 15, and the apostles, they're dealing with the issue of circumcision and things like that, because some of the Jews, that's already an early issue, So there was, so you already got issues like that arising. So I think it's just people, And Paul does tell us, like, there needs to be heresies so that we can see the differences as well. Like, I guess, it's as much as we would like to just have a harmonious Christian, just one, it's I guess because of our sin nature, it's just not possible. And also we have, we have internal issues, people fighting on each other. We have, the sin nature. We also have the devil is against us. There's a lot of different factors that could arise why there's, different teachings and different doctrines and things that come in. Yeah, so. Okay, so that's the Greek fathers. And there's many more, but these are just one of the main ones. I think I've provided a list. I don't know if you have a copy, but I have a bit more mentioned. And then, I sort of have on the sheet their names, obviously the time that they lived in, some of the things that they did, and where they were from, or what textual tradition they were leaned upon. So you'll find the first three there. I got Clement of Rome, which was, he was apostolic father because he was in contact with I believe it was with John. And you also got Polycarp, who was actually a disciple of John.
Yeah.
And so the first three there I just put as early church writings because they didn't have these distinctions yet. And they were in contact with the apostles still, which is quite interesting. But yeah, anyway, that's just for further information. Okay, some of the Latin fathers. So we have Jerome from 347 to 420 AD. He was responsible for the Latin Vulgate translation. So they did, I think, very early because obviously they're from the Western side, so they're going to use a Latin text. So the Vulgate was what they used, I think, originally. And that was a crucial text for the Western Christianity. His textual work was based upon older Greek manuscripts. So obviously the Latin Vulgate underlying that was the original Greek manuscripts that were given, or older, or copies that were given from that. And so he compared these different traditions as well in his translation. And he also criticized the scribal alterations that he found. And he obviously, it makes sense with the work that he did with the Vulgate. He emphasized that a need for a stable textual tradition. So like now everything's being compiled. Okay, we need to actually get this set. We need to have a Bible we can use, everyone can use. And so he was one of the early ones to do that. I do find it interesting that he was criticizing scribal alterations. So not typically you'll find a manuscript and there's people who study this, but there's various symbols in the manuscripts, and little symbols and little lines and things in here and there, and they're scribal markings. They mean various things. Sometimes they mean like, okay, well, there's doubt about this passage, or this is different, or whatever. Like they mean different things. But yeah, you can go more into that. But so there's people who just study that. It's quite interesting. The scribal, what would they call it? Yeah, some of their methods and things that they did. Okay, and then we have Augustine, which is a famous, very famous Christian theologian. So he was from the Latin Western community. So he was from 354 to 430 AD. He was the bishop of, bishop, pastor, whatever you want to, so synonymous terms, of Hippo, and he was a theologian and philosopher. Wrote several books. We still have them today. He acknowledged variations in text and manuscripts, so that's interesting as well. And obviously, being a Latin speaker, he favoured the old Latin text, but he was obviously aware of the Greek text as well, because from memory he does interact with some of that. So again, whether or not these were, I don't know how different these manuscripts are. From what I understand, some of the Western manuscripts were a bit more paraphrased. They weren't as word for word translated as, more strictly translated or copied in the Greek or the Byzantine or the Alexandrian. And obviously the Latin is coming from the Greek traditions as well, whether it's Alexandrian or the Byzantine. And then we have Tertullian, which is early one, 155 to 220 AD. And he was one of the earliest Latin Christian authors. And his New Testament citations reflect early Western tradition, which is, so he's was quite distinct from the Byzantine and Alexandrian, which is quite interesting. as well. And I do wonder, like, does it have to do with the language? Because if you translate something from another language, that changes things as well. So you do have to wonder some of these things, or is it? Yeah, what I would like to know, because it's hard to say what's the factors, what cause these differences. Sure, we can say, okay, there may be an agenda to just change the Bible, but if you look at it, you don't find, it's not like there's changes, but like how drastic are they? Like, it's not like, obviously we still have we have all those variants, which the variants themselves show us the differences, because otherwise if we just had one type, we would not know, we would have nothing else to compare it with. So it kind of, there is a positive aspect to it. But it's just what's the factors, why are they distinct? What caused this distinction? Was it political? Was it just because they wanted to change it, or they didn't agree with it? Why, and and that's nothing. That's one of the arguments with the Byzantine, because it seems like the Byzantine text sort of made it more clear. It dealt with various difficult grammatical constructs and smoothed out the readings a bit, which sort of makes sense because they were used predominantly in churches, so to be read out loud. So if you're going to do that, you're going to make it sound good. It's going to make sense and it'd be clear, and so that could be a factor. Now, is that a change in the text? Depends how you define change. That's the question. Because also you can go into spelling. There's different spellings. Is that a significant change? Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And that could be just, again, language problems, language issues, translation, things you have to deal with in translation. Because even, probably getting ahead of ourselves here, but even in the King James, because it's an English text, if you're translating it from Greek or Hebrew, translation doesn't happen just, word for word. A lot you can do, but a lot of it you're trying to find, what's the English equivalent to this word? That's just naturally, and God obviously knew that. He knew that was the case. He created languages. He knew that that's going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with. And the fact that we even have all these manuscripts still preserved, also, if we have the English, if there's any more debate, let's go back, and so, we're quite safe with the Bible. There's more than enough information for us. So the text of the Gospels in a patristic writing. So Clement of Alexandria, I mentioned him already. In his Gospel citations, he shows various diversity. So I think I already mentioned this already. So Matthew and Mark, he uses the Byzantine. In Luke, he uses the Byzantine and Western, so he mixes it there. And in John, he uses Alexandrian. So again, his works suggest that the Byzantine type text was not a late medieval development, but it obviously had a presence in the 2nd and 3rd century. Same time, and this would be my argument to the Alexandrian people. If that was the oldest and best and the original, because it's the oldest and best, well, why do we find Byzantine readings at the same time? So that kind of oldest and best argument is quite pointless, and it doesn't really matter. So that's what I found interesting in looking into this. The use of the Byzantine text shows that not the medieval late development. So same point, same argument. Okay, John Chrysostom's use of the Gospels. So obviously he's the leading proponent of the Byzantine text. His writings of the Gospel of John, in particular, shows a moderate Byzantine text with Caesarean influences. And again, the Caesarean thing is just another minor textual family that again was existing at that time. Again, it's consistent. He used consistent use of readings that were found in later manuscripts. So obviously, John, you may not have the early Byzantine manuscripts from the time that he was alive. Maybe they disappeared, whatever. They don't exist anymore. But this is where the citations come in. Why they're so valuable? Because he cited those texts. And then we find later Byzantine manuscripts that are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, sure, these manuscripts are a bit later, 6th century or whatever, but because his citation and the time he was alive brings it back earlier. So yeah, there's a bit of that as well. Yeah. So again, yeah, to me that shows me the value of the citations and the quotations that they had. Yeah, because that's right. They're quoting this reading, and at a much earlier date. Yeah. His homilies, or his preaching shows Byzantine readings were dominant in the Eastern Christian community by the 4th century. So again, it counters that point that the Alexandrian people make. Okay. Also, Origen's influence on textual criticism. So he obviously, like I mentioned before, documented differences between manuscripts in his work. He obviously was a very scholarly person. He was very highly systematic. So his writings reveal that textual variants existed very early in Christian history. Again, that there are variants shows, again, there's differences, and shows again that Byzantine type text, it's all coexisted at the same time. And so you can't argue, based on this point, you can't argue that the Alexandrian was the original first type.
It's not like Alexandria was like 50 years and then
Exactly. So if we're finding that they're all being used at the same time, well, okay. And then, so he leaned towards the Alexandrian text, but was aware of the Byzantine readings as well. Okay, so some of the key observations from this is that, we already discussed this, but the Byzantine text was already present present in the writings of people who predominantly use the Alexandrian texts, and it's also present in the ones who use the, obviously, Byzantine text as well. We also have Alexandrian text, again, coexisted with the other text types. We discussed this already. And then quotations show that no single text type dominated the early Christian community. So there doesn't seem to be any dominance yet. Yeah. So people are sort of just using this text. And again, is it because it's whatever's available to them? Possibly, but we do find other people dealing with different manuscripts as well. So, what was their criteria, or like, how did they decide? Okay, I want to use this one. So that's another. Again, we don't have all this information, but yeah, and it could be that, again, information that we don't have. For example, okay, well, they had this manuscript, and they knew who they got it from. Okay, well, this is from the church in Ephesus, and Ephesus has a deep history. It's one of the ones mentioned. We know its history. It could be that. Yeah. So we don't. Again, there's a lot of information we don't know. We just sort of just we try to figure out.
Leaders at that time come around being like, we should use this text or not
I'll have to look. Yeah, I'll have to look at all the writings, but whether they looked at it as a negative sense, I'm not sure. I'm sure there might be some, but that'll be good. It'll be something good to look into. Yeah, again, you have to go through all these church and their writings, and bit of a task.
20 years later.
Yeah.
got that answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, we find that later Byzantine dominance was likely due to its liturgical use. Again, another term that we don't really use today, but basically just using their church services. And yeah, ecclesiastical preservation. So basically, the local church, was responsible for preserving them. So they would get a manuscript. Their responsibility really is to copy it, and pass it on, or make more copies. Yeah. Yes. Okay. And again, part of the preservation process was, like I said, was even the quotations or the citations that they make in their own works. So that's interesting. Okay. All right. A little bit about the differences now. So a lot of this we probably already spoke about, but yeah, there's early Byzantine support again. So the main proponent is John Chrysostom, but there's other fathers that were using Theodoret and Basil. They all used Byzantine texts, or texts that align with the Byzantine text. The church use and lectionaries. So basically, lectionary is that's what we do when we do Bible readings on Sunday night, because we have a schedule of Bible reading. That's what lectionary is. So at a specific time, we read this verse, we read this passage. So the Byzantine was preserved through those lectionary readings, which were widespread across that region. There's a Codex Petropolitanus, which is kept in in St. Petersburg in Russia. There's a few things in that codex, but the early parts of it has references or citations from the church fathers. It also has, I believe, some references to the Gospels as well, which is Byzantine. So again, there's other manuscripts that support this. The challenges, these are probably the challenges that are given by people who are, opposed to the Byzantine readings. They say, well, it's just the Byzantine is just textual harmonization. They just try to harmonize everything in the Bible, make it sound better and smoother. And so, how can we trust it? However, this proves careful transmission and not editorial revision. Because editorial revision would be like changing things completely, like taking verses out, for example, which is what the Alexandrian does. Okay. Furthermore, in Alexandrian, so we find obviously fathers using the Alexandrian readings, but they were not universal. They weren't dominant. Whereas we find with the Byzantine, it's a bit more dominance there. Some of the strengths and criticisms of it. So the advocates of the Alexandrian manuscripts claim that they're the oldest, which then they say, which makes them closer to the original, so they therefore must be correct. However, patristic citations show that Byzantine readings existed again, similar time, 4th century and earlier. Again, this challenges the Alexandrian primacy, like saying that was the only one or that was the main one. So it challenges that point, and this is a point that they often use, to modern time. They still use that. Yeah. Basically, these are oldest. We found these date earlier than everything that we have. Therefore, they must be correct. That's not, okay, yeah, and you found it in 1844, and we've had. So where were these, for the last almost 2,000 years? We didn't know. So it's obviously God didn't think they were that important, like to that crucial. Because what about if they were the originals or the one that were the correct ones? What about all the other Christians throughout the ages? What did they read? You know. Yeah. Okay. So basically a summary, and yeah, I do sort of give a balanced perspective here. But the Byzantine text, so it's the majority in later manuscripts, and yeah, we acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean just because we have later manuscripts doesn't mean there was no early witness of these readings, which I think there were. Early patristic supports preserved through local churches. For the Alexandrian texts, yeah, sure, we have, they're quite early, and obviously we know that they're preferred in a modern criticism. We know this because there's so many modern versions today. But there was limited manuscript survival. There's not many of them. Not particularly the fire. It's just we just haven't found as many, or there's not many of them as there is of the majority. Sure, the argument then is like, okay, well, the majority texts, most of them are much later, but there's more of them. Whereas the Alexandrian texts, sure there could be earlier, yet there is very little of them. And that could, again, there could be a bunch of reasons why that is the case. So a more balanced view would be, okay, both traditions played a role in preserving the New Testament. Byzantine readings are not necessarily later additions, nor Alexandrian automatically more authentic. So yeah, it's a more balanced view. You've got to be fair on both sides here, in the sense that these things are facts, but how do we deal with it, and how far can we use these facts to drive the point that we're trying to make, for example, which is the right text. There's got to be more involved than just the age of the manuscript. Okay, so oldest and best fallacy in textual criticism. So basically survival bias. Just because a manuscript is older does not mean it's more accurate. Many manuscripts perish due to climate and persecution, while later ones survive due to better preservation techniques or conditions. So it could be possible that we don't have earlier Byzantine readings or texts or manuscripts because maybe they were just read so much that they wore out, which happened. Persecution, gathered up, burnt, that happened. You got a bunch of factors that people don't really think about. And obviously later, when Christianity was more established, didn't have the persecution as, really anymore. And techniques of preservation were better, that's why we have the later manuscripts. That's why they seem to exist even to today. So the absence of older manuscripts, Byzantine manuscripts, does not mean they didn't exist. Again, one thing that I put was maybe they were just used more, and so they wore out faster. Which is what we find, because when you look at the Vaticanus, I think it is, or maybe this is Sinaiticus, it looks pristine, like it hardly is being used, so. Yeah, I guess the Alexandrian, maybe it was more like because the Alexandrian side of things seemed to be more academic, maybe it was just a personal text. Maybe it wasn't actually used in the churches, which is, I think it's an issue, because we find the Byzantine they made sure these are used in the churches. So, yeah, it's interesting. Again, we don't know some of these things, so it's hard to say. Also, the copying conditions and textual integrity. So younger manuscripts copied from a more reliable source is obviously going to be more superior to an older one with errors. So just because we have a later manuscript, which has all the verses, which has all, and then the older ones that we know that the verses have been taken out or things have been changed, well, just because it's older doesn't mean that's right. Again, the age, it doesn't, yeah. And then we have early manuscripts, particularly Alexandrian texts, often show evidence of scribal corrections and omissions, and we talked about this last lesson, and also marginal notes as well. So this is indicating that they weren't always faithfully copied. Some of them may have been, but we also find, and because this is the issue, there's so little of the Alexandrian texts, they differ from each other. They also have alterations which are noted. Again, it's not really a good case to trust in those texts. Yeah, whereas we have a majority text, which again, sure, some of them differ from each other, but you have a vast, amount where you can compare and come to a point where, what is there and what shouldn't be there. Okay, and then we have the other thing, the majority and continuity of this as well. So if later manuscripts consistently agree with one another across time and geography, they likely reflect a stable, preserved tradition rather than a corrupted or secondary text. And the Byzantine text, even though it's later in surviving manuscripts, demonstrates continuity and consistency, which again indicates preservation rather than alteration. So it got to the point now where, we find very early there are alterations, with the Alexandrian. In the Byzantine, we have the readings of them, but then we don't really see them change. We don't see them change really at all. So to me, that means that in their mind, well, this is fine. We don't need to do anything to this. So they just copied it. They preserved it as it was. So again, makes the point, age alone doesn't determine accuracy. Obviously, there's the quality of the manuscript, there's a reliability, there's transmission history behind it. What's the transmission history behind it? Again, oldest is not necessarily the best. The best is the one that's been faithfully preserved for us. Okay, so basically, how did the church fathers evaluate variants? So now I'm just going to, there's a bunch of different church fathers that will be mentioned here, and then just a little bit about what, their contributions or their evaluations of variants. So the first one is Irenaeus, quite early, 130 to 202 AD. So he defended specific readings based on doctrinal consistency. So again, I guess that sort of answers your question before about whether they, so he's arguing against various heretical alterations. So there was Gnostic corruptions of texts. So he actually has a book called Against Heresies. So you can read it, it still exists today, very early on. So Irenaeus is against heresy. So it's quite, he deals with all these different groups. Yeah, bit of a theological bulldog. Yeah. Yeah. Tertullian, we mentioned him already. So he advocated for the preservation of readings found in churches established by the apostles. So he would say, okay, no, we only read those manuscripts that come from the churches that the apostles started. So again, he's emphasizing a more traditional transmission of the text. So again, not just taking any manuscript from any place. And obviously we don't have anything, this is not a strong point, but we don't find, from what I can remember, anything in the New Testament about the apostles establishing the churches in Egypt. Sure, there was Christians went there, but we don't find any information, biblically, about any apostle going there. So maybe they did, we don't know, just from a biblical point of view. Yeah. Sure. But then even after that, Philip was caught out. He went. Where did he go after? He went up north. So he didn't even go to Egypt. But we do have information about Antioch. We have information about the churches of Asia, Ephesus, all those places. The region of Galatia, all that. Well, there would have been, but this is very much a Greek Egypt now, because so sure, the Greeks, some of it like sort of romanticized some of the old Egyptian stuff, but yeah, it was I don't think it was anything like how it was prior. Yeah. Because even you already had established Jewish communities here they've been there for hundreds of years already, so yeah. Well, that there were Jewish communities there. Obviously, the Christians were going to go there and preach to the Jews there. So that obviously happened. But yeah, interesting there. Okay, Cyril of Alexandria. So he referred to textual differences, but often followed a theological rather than a purely textual approach in resolving disputes. So he was more interested in, what's going to support my theology. And then Ambrose, he used textual variants to support theological arguments, demonstrating awareness of multiple readings, but he prioritized those that were ecclesiastically approved. So those that were approved by the churches. He would deal with the other manuscripts, but ultimately prioritize the ones that were used in the local churches. Okay, and then we have some of their testimonies on the differences. So Theodoret of Cryptus, I don't know how to say that word. I don't know how they would. Depends on the C how they. His citations align with the Byzantine text, suggesting that these readings were already widespread. Again, the same argument that we've been trying to make. Hesychius of Alexandria, credited with the Alexandrian recension of the Old Testament, illustrating how early textual revision shaped scriptural transmission. So he did a bit of work with the Old Testament. Then we have Epiphanius of Salamis. He rejected certain readings as later interpolations, preferring texts that conform to early ecclesiastical usage. So again, we do find a lot of what you were saying before. Where we find that they rejected certain ones. So they preferred, and it seems like a lot of them preferred, what's the church, what has the church been given? And that's right. Because we find, obviously in the New Testament, the letters were given to churches. So who best to actually go to or preserve the text, it would be the churches. Whereas we find with these Alexandrian texts, we find, it seems to be very isolated. I could be wrong in that, but that's the sense that I get. Victor of Antioch, he compiled various textual variations in his commentary on Mark, and he shows evidence of both Alexandrian and Byzantine influences in textual tradition. So again, showing the coexistence of that. And then we have Cassiodorus. He promoted the standardization of the Latin Bible and demonstrated, again, early concerns about the purity of the text and how the scribes were transmitting this to us as well. Okay, so that's some of the other church fathers. Quite a lot of interesting information there. You could take one of them, it could be quite interesting. Yes. So lectionary influence on Byzantine stability. So we already looked at this a little bit already, but the Byzantine text became more dominant partly due to its use in churches. So obviously as churches grew, it became more dominant. The Byzantine manuscripts show evidence of liturgical formatting, so verse divisions, markings for public reading, notes to guide the readers in worship. So a lot of this manuscripts had these types of information in it. We also find what I mentioned before, the Codex Protopolitanus, and other lectionary-based manuscripts as well. Again, this is probably a lot we've already mentioned, but contains these same lectionary markings, showing that scribes copied and preserved texts primarily for church use, rather than private study material.
So people that you and I would be walking around
No, not typically. No.
Unless you were, even if you were like crazy wealthy, bro.
Yeah. I guess it's quite expensive anyway to have a book and get it copied and everything like that. With the material, yeah. So that's why that's why it would be so valuable to meet with the fellow Christians, because you're meeting to hear the word,
It's not like you get to go.
And I do often think about, because what if it was the case for us, like how, because we have a Bible, it's so accessible and available to us, and look at us, so it's there's no that urgency or that I've got to go because I need to hear the word. I don't, where am I going to go? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, little thing pops up. And it's just verse for the day. Yeah. Whereas you could sort of imagine the importance that they held, or the urgency. Like, okay, I've got to go listen. I want to listen to every word this person's saying. Yeah. And so obviously there would, and I think that's something that maybe modern churches are not as today. Like we do it to a point, whereas the reading of passages, but they would read. That would be almost a predominant part of the service, just reading the scriptures, and then you would have a bit of a sermon, a bit of a, whereas in modern sort of Christianity we have little text and then the sermon, so it's like what's right, what's wrong, whatever. But I guess the Bible, Paul does tell, I think it's Timothy, give heed to the reading of the word. That's important. And when you think about the context of that time, where not everyone had a Bible, gathering in a church setting was the only time they really heard the word of God read. So, it's important. And maybe their memory was better, like their memorization techniques were better as well. So they, Well, that's right. And they didn't. That's if they wanted to, they had to remember it. And that's what we find, especially that's what we find in the early times. And I guess as Baptists, we often put this down because but the creeds and things like that. Sure, we don't agree with them doctrinally and everything, but what was the purpose of them? Well, the purpose was to have a little bit of information that they could memorize on the basic doctrines of Christianity. That they believe that that Jesus is the Son of God, fully man, fully God. That's a crucial doctrine. And so, sure, that's not written in that way in the Bible. Obviously, the Bible teaches it. But for them to remember these doctrines and beliefs, it makes sense that they had these documents. Yeah. Okay, just to end with this. So why does this matter for textual criticism? For the study of manuscripts and things like that. But the Byzantine text is not a late invention, but is early patristic support. So we established that. The patristic citations provide crucial evidence for textual transmission. So that's why it matters. And looking at it from a balanced approach, which considers the Alexandrian and Byzantine readings, to understand where the history of the text and the Bible, again, we make the point that Alexandrian manuscripts may be older, but again, doesn't make it more original. Again, I guess the point of the study was just look at the citations, and the citations and the quotations show that a lot of the Byzantine readings were used quite early on. So if that's basically the main argument, I guess, of this lesson, really. The value of the citations, but also what does that mean? What does it mean? Why do we think that these citations are important? And that's why it's important for us. Okay, let's